Vulnerability is not weakness. It is the birthplace of courage because it asks us to step into the unknown without armor, to open our hearts without guarantees, to let others see the real, unpolished, unedited versions of ourselves that we so often try to hide. It is in vulnerability that we find the strength to say, I don't know, or I need help, or I made a mistake, even though those admissions feel terrifying in a world that celebrates perfection and control. It is in vulnerability that we find the bravery to risk love, knowing full well that love might not always be returned, and to risk creativity, knowing that our ideas may fail or be criticized, and to risk trust, knowing that people may not always handle it with care. Vulnerability asks us to show up without the certainty of success, to speak even when our voice trembles, to try even when failure seems possible, to care even when indifference feels safer, because it is only in that raw, exposed space that true courage, growth, and human connection can exist. Shame thrives in secrecy but loses power when spoken, because silence is the oxygen that keeps it alive, whispering in the corners of our minds that we are unworthy, that we are not enough, that if anyone knew the truth about us, we would be rejected or abandoned. It hides in the shadows of our hearts, convincing us to cover up, to pretend, to wear masks so carefully crafted that even we begin to mistake them for our real selves. Yet the moment we break that silence, the moment we choose to give voice to the story we've been carrying alone, shame begins to shrink, its grip loosens, and it no longer has the same hold over us. When we share our truth with someone who meets it with empathy rather than judgment, shame cannot survive because empathy says, "Me too. You are not alone." Speaking our shame doesn't just free us. It opens the door for others to step into their own truth, creating connection where isolation once lived, and reminding us that the things we fear make us unlovable are often the very things that make us most deeply human. Empathy is the antidote to shame because it offers the healing presence that shame cannot survive, the gentle reminder that we are not alone in our struggles, that our imperfections do not make us unworthy of love or belonging, but instead make us human. Shame isolates. It pushes us into silence, convincing us that no one could possibly understand, that if we dared to reveal our flaws, rejection would follow. But empathy steps in as a bridge, saying, I see you, I hear you, and I've been there too, dissolving the walls that shame works so hard to build. Empathy does not try to fix or judge or dismiss, but simply sits with us in the hard places, validating our experience and creating a space where healing can begin. When someone listens with compassion, when they allow our pain to exist without trying to erase it, shame loses its grip, because it can no longer convince us that we are alone or broken beyond repair. Empathy transforms what once felt like unbearable isolation into connection, weaving our stories into a shared human experience where our worth is no longer in question, and our pain is no longer carried in silence. Connection is why we are here. It gives life meaning, because at the core of every human being is the longing to be seen, to be known, and to be accepted for who we are without having to earn it or prove it. We are wired for belonging, for shared laughter, for hands to hold when life feels heavy, for voices that remind us we matter when our own self-doubt grows too loud. Without connection, even the greatest achievements feel hollow, because success loses its sweetness when there is no one to share it with, and joy fades quickly when it is not multiplied by the presence of others. Connection is not about the number of people around us, but about the depth of relationships that allow us to show up authentically, without masks or performances, and still feel safe and valued. It is in connection that we learn resilience, because the weight of life is never meant to be carried alone. And it is in connection that we discover purpose, because our lives touch others in ways we may never fully see, but are always deeply felt. Connection makes the ordinary sacred, the difficult bearable, and the fleeting moments of life unforgettable, reminding us that our stories are never meant to be written in isolation, but woven together in a tapestry of shared humanity. Perfectionism is a 20-ton shield that keeps us from being seen because it convinces us that if we can just perform flawlessly, achieve without error, and present ourselves without cracks, then we will finally be safe from judgment, rejection, or failure. It masquerades as motivation, whispering that it pushes us toward excellence, when in reality it chains us to fear and exhaustion, draining the joy from our efforts because nothing ever feels good enough. Behind perfectionism is always the belief that our worth is tied to what we produce, how we look, or how others perceive us, and so we polish and edit and rehearse, hoping to avoid the vulnerability of being truly known. But that endless striving only distances us from authentic connection, because people cannot connect with the mask. We are loved and accepted in the places where we are real, not where we are flawless. The shield of perfectionism may feel protective, but it also isolates us, keeping us from the intimacy of being seen in our humanity, in our messiness, in our truth. Where real belonging and real freedom are found, courage begins with showing up, even when we cannot control the outcome, because it is in those uncertain moments that our true strength is revealed. The strength to step into the arena of life without the guarantee of applause, without the promise of success, without the comfort of knowing how the story will end. It means raising our hand in the meeting, even when our idea might be dismissed. Having the difficult conversation, even when reconciliation is not certain. Or pursuing a dream, even when the possibility of failure feels terrifyingly real. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward with fear still present. To allow our hearts to beat fast and our hands to shake while still choosing to take the step that matters. It is a practice of presence, of saying, I am here. Not because I know it will all work out, but because hiding would cost me more than trying. Courage refuses to let uncertainty dictate our lives, reminding us that showing up is in itself a victory, because every act of courage plants the seed for growth, for connection, for transformation. In ways we may never fully predict or measure, we cannot selectively numb emotions. When we numb pain, we also numb joy, because the human heart does not come with a filter that allows us to turn down sorrow without also dimming love, laughter, and gratitude. When we push away grief, disappointment, or fear, we may think we are protecting ourselves, but what we are really doing is building walls so thick that the light cannot get in either. Numbing can take many forms: overwork, constant distraction, endless scrolling, unhealthy coping. But no matter how cleverly we disguise it, the cost is always the same: the dulling of our aliveness. To live fully means to feel it all, the highs and the lows, the beauty and the heartbreak, the joy that makes us dance and the sorrow that makes us weep, because each emotion deepens our capacity for the other. Pain carves out the space in us where joy can dwell, just as loss teaches us to treasure what we still have, and struggle helps us recognize the sweetness of peace. To choose to feel, even when it hurts, is to choose to be awake to the fullness of life, to refuse the half-lived existence that numbing offers and instead embrace the raw, messy, vibrant spectrum of what it means to be human. Worthiness does not come from achievement. It is our birthright, because no amount of success, validation, or external approval can add to or take away from the inherent value we carry simply by existing. From the moment we take our first breath, we are enough. Yet somewhere along the way we are taught that love must be earned, that belonging must be proven, that our worth is conditional on performance, appearance, or accomplishment. We start chasing milestones, grades, promotions, titles, possessions, believing that if we can just reach the next level, then we will finally feel complete. But the finish line keeps moving and the hunger never ends. The truth is that worthiness is not a prize we win. It is a truth we accept. When we embrace this, we stop living as if our value hangs in the balance of other people's opinions and start living from a place of freedom, confidence, and authenticity. Knowing our worth allows us to set boundaries without guilt, to love without desperation, to create without fear of failure, and to rest without shame. It shifts our lives from constant striving to intentional living, because we no longer act from a place of trying to prove ourselves, but from the grounded certainty that we already are enough. Belonging is not about fitting in. It's about being accepted for who you are, because fitting in requires us to twist, shrink, or disguise pieces of ourselves in order to be tolerated, while true belonging asks us to stand as we are and trust that our authenticity is enough. Fitting in is about performance, about scanning the room to figure out who we need to be in order to gain approval, about putting on masks that win us temporary acceptance but leave us feeling unseen and exhausted. Belonging, however, is the deep exhale of being with people who do not demand our perfection, who can hold space for our flaws, our quirks, and our contradictions, who see us not as a role we play, but as a whole person with a story that matters. Real belonging liberates us from the loneliness of pretending, because it does not require us to barter pieces of our soul for connection. It gives us the freedom to show up without the heavy armor of pretense. When we experience true belonging, we understand that home is not a place but the presence of people who make us feel that we are enough exactly as we are. And it is in those spaces that love deepens, trust grows, and connection becomes life, giving rather than life, draining stories our data with soul. Sharing them makes us human, because facts and figures can inform the mind. But it is stories that reach into the heart, that breathe life into experiences, and that allow us to see one another not just as names or numbers, but as living, feeling beings with struggles, dreams, and hopes. When we tell our stories, we weave threads of connection that say, "I've been there too," or "I may not know exactly what you've walked through, but I can feel the humanity in your words." Stories carry the weight of memory, the lessons of failure, the joy of triumph, and the vulnerability of truth, transforming abstract ideas into moments we can feel and remember. They remind us that behind every statistic is a person, behind every challenge is a journey, and behind every face is a depth of experiences that cannot be measured in data alone. Sharing our stories is an act of courage, because it means revealing parts of ourselves that we often keep hidden. Yet it is in that revelation that healing and connection are born, allowing others to find pieces of themselves in what we speak, and showing us that we are never as alone as shame tries to convince us we are. Through stories, we preserve wisdom, ignite empathy, and pass down meaning in a way that no chart or lecture could ever hold. Because stories carry the pulse of life itself, vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. Because it is the willingness to speak words that tremble in our throats, to admit what we do not know, to share what we fear most people might not understand, and to show parts of ourselves that are tender and unpolished in a world that often demands perfection and certainty. It is the shaky voice that says, "I need help," the quiet confession that reveals a hidden wound, the bold declaration of love without any promise it will be returned, and the decision to stand in authenticity when it would be easier to blend in or hide. Vulnerability is not comfortable, but it is the birthplace of growth, because every step we take into the unknown with an open heart stretches us into new depths of strength and resilience. It is not dramatic or loud. Often it shows up in the smallest of moments. The phone call we finally make, the boundary we set, the apology we give, the forgiveness we offer. Yet those moments carry the weight of transformation, because they remind us that real courage is not about eliminating fear, but about choosing to show up while fear still lingers. Vulnerability exposes us to uncertainty, but it also opens the door to intimacy, creativity, and connection. Because truth and courage are the very things that allow us to experience love, belonging, and freedom in their fullest form. Compassion starts with being kind to ourselves first, because the way we speak to our own hearts sets the tone for how we show up in the world, and without self-kindness, our compassion for others easily becomes shallow, performative, or conditional. So often we extend patience, forgiveness, and understanding to the people around us while reserving the harshest criticism, the sharpest judgment, and the most relentless pressure for ourselves, as if our worth must be constantly proven before we deserve gentleness. True compassion, however, is born in the quiet act of turning that same grace inward, of recognizing that we too are human, that we too stumble and struggle, that we too deserve rest, forgiveness, and care. When we learn to soften the inner voice that tells us we are not enough, when we allow ourselves to rest without guilt, when we treat our flaws as part of our humanity instead of evidence of our inadequacy, we cultivate a foundation strong enough to offer real compassion to others. Being kind to ourselves does not make us selfish. It makes us whole, because the well we draw from in caring for others cannot stay full if we are constantly draining ourselves dry. Self-compassion is what steadies us in moments of failure, what grounds us in times of uncertainty, and what keeps us from abandoning ourselves in the pursuit of meeting everyone else's needs. Authenticity is a daily practice of letting go of who we think we should be, because every day we are faced with the temptation to perform, to wear masks, to present polished versions of ourselves that win approval but silence our truth. It asks us to loosen the grip of expectations, those placed on us by family, culture, or society, and instead choose the slower, braver path of honoring who we really are, even when that risks disapproval or misunderstanding. Authenticity is not a single choice we make once and keep forever. It is a rhythm, a commitment renewed moment by moment, in conversations where honesty feels risky, in decisions where conformity feels safer, in relationships where vulnerability feels terrifying. It is about releasing the heavy burden of comparison and perfection, recognizing that the truest connections and the deepest peace can only come when we allow ourselves to be fully seen, unedited, and unmasked. When we live in authenticity, we give others permission to do the same, creating spaces where people can breathe freely, where belonging is rooted in truth instead of performance, where love is not earned but shared. Authenticity demands courage because it asks us to trade approval for integrity, to choose truth over comfort, and to embrace the messy, imperfect, extraordinary reality of being human rather than the illusion of who we think we should be. To love is to risk not being loved back, and that's what makes it real, because love, at its core, is an act of vulnerability, a decision to open ourselves fully without any guarantee of how the other person will respond. It means placing our hearts in someone else's hands, knowing they could choose to cherish it or to walk away, and still daring to give anyway. Love cannot be controlled, measured, or insured against loss. It is a leap into uncertainty, a surrender of safety, a willingness to feel deeply even when the outcome is unknown. If love were certain, it would not require courage, it would not stretch us, it would not transform us. It would be a transaction, not a connection. The risk of unreciprocated love is what sharpens its beauty, because it reminds us that what we are offering is not performance or negotiation, but the raw gift of ourselves. To love is to say, I choose you, even when rejection is possible, to invest time, energy, and hope into another soul without a contract promising return. It is in that risk that intimacy is born, because both joy and heartbreak are possible, and only by accepting that truth can we experience the fullness of love's depth, the richness of its vulnerability, and the freedom of giving without demanding certainty in return. The most eye-opening moments are not when we avoid fear, but when we face it, because fear has a way of magnifying itself in the shadows, growing larger and heavier the longer we run from it, while the act of turning toward it reveals that its power was never as great as we imagined. Facing fear does not mean we stop trembling or suddenly feel brave. It means we allow the trembling and still step forward, carrying the uncertainty with us rather than letting it paralyze us. These moments strip away the illusions of control and perfection we cling to, showing us that growth happens not in the absence of fear, but in the willingness to walk through it with open eyes and a steady heart. When we confront fear, we begin to see ourselves more clearly, realizing that courage was not something we lacked, but something that awakens only when called upon. Fear faced becomes a teacher, illuminating our deepest values, exposing the limits we've outgrown, and revealing the strength we did not know was ours. It is in these moments that our perspective shifts, because what once seemed impossible begins to feel like a path forward, and what once kept us small transforms into the very fire that shapes resilience, wisdom, and freedom in the end. The most eye-opening moments of our lives are rarely ones that come wrapped in certainty or comfort. They are the moments when we dare to step out from behind our masks, when we choose connection over isolation, when we embrace vulnerability not as weakness, but as the truest expression of courage. They are the moments when shame is silenced by empathy, when perfection gives way to authenticity, and when fear becomes the doorway to growth rather than the barrier to it. These are the moments that strip us down to what is most human and most real, reminding us that our worth is not something we must earn, but something we must claim. If even in the span of 14 minutes we can remember this truth, that to love, to risk, to show up, to feel, and to belong are the very things that make life meaningful, then those minutes have the power to change not just how we see the world, but how we live within it.